Three, two, one. All right. Welcome, friends. As you can see, we've got the great Adam Klasfeld with us again today of All Rise News. I've said it before, and as an officer of the court, I will continue to say it. You know, Adam represents the best gavel to gavel coverage of the most consequential legal cases of the day. And that's why I'm thrilled that he's always willing to join us and talk about what he is seeing. So first of all, Adam, welcome and bring us up to speed on the brand new court order handed down by Judge Jeb Boasberg in what we call the JGG case.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Glenn. Yes, this is a major development, and this was a development that folks who were listening into a hearing earlier this week saw coming, that Judge Boasberg was going to issue some relief for the 137 men who were whisked out of the country. I mean, there were larger numbers at the time, but the number of people who are the subject of this order, 137 men who were whisked onto deportation flights without notice or a hearing back in March 2025. So this is 11 months later. And now Judge Boasberg set a path forward, a path where some of them can get relieved. Many of them, folks remember, were sent to the terrorism prison in El Salvador, CCOT, where there was torture. Many of them have now been sent to Venezuela. This order pertains to the Venezuelan men and anyone in third countries from those March flights. And the substance of the order is pretty basic, and it follows the logic of the Supreme Court's ruling in Abrego Garcia. He was wrongly deported. You must facilitate the release of the person who is wrongly spirited out of the country and provide some sort of avenue for relief, some sort of hearing. That hearing by Judge Boasberg's ruling can happen from abroad, but it has to happen. And I want to point to one line that really just encapsulates everything. I'm going to read the line before it, but you'll see which line I'm talking about. The court offered the government the opportunity to propose steps that would facilitate hearings for the class members on their habeas corpus claims so they could challenge their designations under the Alien Enemies Act and the validity of the president's proclamation. Apparently not interested in participating in this process, the government's responses essentially told the court to pound sand. So Judge Boasberg, paying attention to the fact that the government, instead of actually finding some sort of solution to remedy the due process violations that have nearly lasted 1 year, has gone to attack him, has gone to try to file a bogus disciplinary complaint that was rejected. And he says very wryly after that, believing there are other courses that are more productive and in line with the Supreme Court's requirements outlined in Nome v. Abrego Garcia, the court will now order the government to facilitate the return from third countries from those plaintiffs who so desire. It will also permit other plaintiffs to file habeas supplements from abroad. That is to say, more productive solutions than Judge Boasberg pounding sand.
And let's be clear, Judge Boasberg gave the DOJ attorneys any number of opportunities to weigh in with how they might go about remedying what was clearly an unconstitutional deportation of these men. And so, listen, he didn't pull any punches in that sentence you read. He said, I tried, and DOJ told me to go pound sand. But let me just highlight something else you mentioned, Adam, because DOJ didn't just tell him to pound sand. They were apparently so angry and upset with him, because he was basically trying to enforce the constitutional rights of people who had been wrongfully deported, that they filed a baseless complaint against him. And I call it baseless for a reason. And I believe it was filed by a character named Chad Mizell, who was Pam Bondi's chief of staff, perhaps, at some point. He has since left the Department of Justice. But It was claiming that Judge Boasberg demonstrated some bias in some comment he made. They filed this complaint. They presented no evidence. And when the Court of Appeals, I believe it was the Sixth Circuit that was tapped with, looking into this complaint, asked Mizell, present some evidence, they steadfastly refused. They failed to back up their bogus allegations. And of course, the complaint was dismissed. Maybe DOJ thought, that would intimidate Jeb Boasberg. Mm-mm. Chief Judge Boasberg does not intimidate. Take it from somebody who worked directly with him, tried a high profile murder case with him, and supervised him when he was an assistant United States attorney. So what is the remedy now going forward that Judge Boasberg has put in place in this order? What is he requiring the plaintiffs to do, the attorneys representing the people who were wrongfully deported, and what has he told the Department of Justice it must do?
So it's a two-part remedy. Those who want to come back to the United States must be afforded some way to do so. And we're talking about the entire universe covered by this order are 137 people. And to just emphasize the truly limited nature of this order, the ACLU has been in communication with what this order describes as a handful of people who want to move forward with that path. And there's another path for people who are in Venezuela who want to establish some sort of habeas proceedings from abroad. This order doesn't lay out the logistics for doing so, but they can do just that. And this is how limited the order is. So when you hear the Trump administration come back as they inevitably will do, and talk about how radically the federal court is trying to inject itself into the prerogative of the executive, this is what's going to happen to the people who actually can benefit from his order. Plaintiffs acknowledge as they must that anyone who is flown back or paroled into the United States after arriving at a port of entry will be taken into U.S. custody during the pendency of further proceedings, and would also potentially be subject to re-deportation at the conclusion of their legal challenges. So this order for 137 people doesn't actually bring those 137 people into the country. And for the people who are actually brought into the country, they have a very difficult road ahead of them. The federal government still has a lot of power to try to lawfully redeport them, to try to lawfully detain them, and then those challenges will be brought. What Judge Boasberg is saying is you have to try whatever you are trying to do again lawfully. You cannot just invoke this wartime statute, the Alien Enemies Act, and say, you guys are terrorists, you guys are gangsters, you guys are train de Aragua, and therefore, because we have accused you of that, you have no rights, you do not get notice, you do not get a hearing, and we can send you to any foreign prison where you can be tortured, and then any other third country around the globe that we see fit. There's a really salient line of his ruling that goes into just that. In other words, it is up to the government to remedy the wrong that it perpetrated here and to provide a means of doing so. Were it otherwise, the government could simply remove people from the United States without providing any process, and once in a foreign country, deny them any right to return for a hearing or opportunity to present their case from abroad. He calls the government's conduct flagrant, and it is flagrant. It doesn't get more flagrant than that. But what he is saying here is that, look, we have been through this in the case of Abrego Garcia. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you have to facilitate his return. And for folks wondering whether this will have an effect, well, in Abrego Garcia's case, he is now back in Maryland awaiting his trial. Is the government making his path back to the United States easy for him? Absolutely not. There are still criminal charges against Kilmar Abrego Garcia. There's still an effort by the government to dump him any number of places on the map, the global map of any authoritarian country, except for the small d democratic country that he has agreed to be sent to, which is Costa Rica. That's a little bit of a glimpse of what we might see ahead. Yes, there are these opportunities for a certain number of these 137 men who the ACLU is in contact with, but it won't be an easy road ahead for any of them. But Judge Boasberg is making clear in this ruling they have rights.
Yeah, so let me circle back and put some exclamation points on those great points you just made. First of all, there was a previous claim by the Department of Justice during this litigation that Judge Boasberg just wants to bring people back from this prison in El Salvador to run wild on the streets of America and hurt American citizens. That was untrue then, and it remains untrue now because of what you just shared with the viewers in this order multiple times. Judge Boasberg said, if these people are brought back to the United States so their cases could be treated the way they should have been treated in the first instance, echoing what the Supreme Court said and affirmed in the Abrego Garcia case, they will be detained. They will be locked up, and they will be subject to deportation anew in the event the government does it right and honors their due process rights of notice and opportunity to be heard. So you can see Judge Boasberg is sort of cutting off at the pass, the same kind of nonsense that we almost inevitably will hear from the Department of Justice. No, the judge is not bringing dangerous people back to let them run wild on the streets of America. They will be detained pending further hearings in this case. And I think it's interesting. He uses the Supreme Court's own language, which had its origin in a ruling from Judge Sini's in Maryland in the Abrego Garcia litigation, that, listen, all that you are required to do is facilitate the release and return to the United States of people that you unconstitutionally deported, like Abrego Garcia. That is what Judge Boasberg is now ordering the Department of Justice to do here. And he makes clear that he is going to have none of these hollow or misleading complaints from the Department of Justice when he adds, it's worth emphasizing that this situation would never have arisen had the government simply afforded plaintiffs their constitutional rights before initially deporting them. So listen, this is a win for the rule of law. This is a win for the Constitution. Now, Adam, in the long run, it may or may not be a win for the immigrants who are brought back and are put through a constitutional deportation hearing and proceeding. But, all Judge Boasberg is doing is insisting that our Department of Justice comply with the Constitution.
Absolutely. And that line that you read, it's a really the salient point, and it happens in a paragraph where Judge Boasberg says that the people who decide to come back to the United States are allowed to do so on the government's dime. Now, the Trump administration wanted to make the people that they wrongly deported pay to get back to the United States. And think about how churlish that is. Think about the fact that these are 137 people who are the subject of this order, who were, they had the money to bring these deportation flights to El Salvador and the money to pay a foreign dictator to house them in his torture prison, but wanted to want to make them pay for the opportunity to have their constitutional rights respected. And Judge Boasberg said of their request to have the government pay for their return, the court deems that a reasonable request because, again, as you noted, Glenn, as Judge Boasberg said, the situation wouldn't have happened but for the violation of the constitutional rights of these 137 individuals.
And it has always angered me, I use that word advisedly, that we took people, most of whom had been convicted of no crime. We took them and we confined them by proxy in another country. How is it that we make an arrangement with another country once these folks are removed from the United States, which would have been the only reason to detain most of them in the first place, right? Pending deportation. How is it that the United States can give them to a foreign country and, notwithstanding the fact they've been convicted of no crime, direct that country to put them in prison? That
Right.
feels like a little thing called wrongful imprisonment to this old prosecutor. So let's finish up with this. Um, can you bring us up to speed on Abrego Garcia? Because we remain keenly interested in that. And that was a bit of a blueprint for what Judge Boasberg just did in this order. What is the status of his challenge of his criminal prosecution in Tennessee, where there is some ongoing vindictive prosecution litigation underway?
Absolutely. I think one of the last times that we spoke, I was going to head out to Nashville to cover the vindictive prosecution hearing, which was ultimately canceled due to weather. I was actually in the airport getting ready to go to Nashville when the court canceled the hearing amid the cold snap that was happening across the country, that had, among other places, brought things to a screeching halt in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Middle District of Tennessee is located. Well, that hearing has been rescheduled toward the end of the month. I will be going to Nashville toward the end of the month for that. And that's the hearing where folks should know Abrego Garcia starts that hearing at an advantage. The fact that a hearing has been called has shifted the burden to the government to overcome the presumption of vindictiveness because he has presented enough evidence of vindictiveness because Todd Blanche went on Fox with Laura Ingraham and said that the origin of Abrego's prosecution was the fact that judges questioned his spiriting out of the country. That was enough evidence for Judge Crenshaw to order this vindictive prosecution hearing where the government is going to have to present enough evidence that this is on the up and up, that the case doesn't get dismissed. So given the stakes of that hearing, I felt that it was important to be there at the end of the month when this takes place.
And interestingly, if that litigation on that motion to dismiss based on vindictive prosecution comes to fruition, I think it will actually be the first case where that issue has been fully litigated because in the James Comey alleged vindictive prosecution case and the Letitia James alleged vindictive prosecution case, those cases got thrown out by the judge for, the problem with Lindsay Halligan, who was not qualified to set foot in the grand jury, obtaining indictments against them. They never did get to the phase of actually litigating the vindictive prosecution claim. So this would be the first one that comes to fruition. And what I will tell our viewers is the minute I read the criminal indictment in the Middle District of Tennessee of Abrego Garcia, I said, this thing stinks. This is a trumped up charge that the DOJ is using to try to save face after they'd been caught unconstitutionally deporting Abrego Garcia to El Salvador. So I can't wait for your coverage of that. And I know we'll be jumping on as soon as we get some result in that litigation. So thank you for being with us and tell everybody where they can find your great reporting.
Thank you so much, Glenn. You can find it at www.allrisenews.com, also right here on Substack. So anywhere you see allrisenews.com, that's my independent journalism founded last April.
Thank you, Adam, for bringing your great reporting to us. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. And I'll be jumping on Substack again a little bit later today. So I hope to see you then. So long.
So long.